Welcome to the Filmlings podcast,
a ghostly podcast where we analyze all that goes into effective filmmaking.
I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Alex.
And this is episode 134, Master Masaki.
Yep, we're doing Masaki Kobayashi today. One of just an amazing filmmaker out of Japan who has some very identifiable films, even if his name doesn't resonate quite as frequently among cinephile types.
Although this is not the first time he's appeared on the Filmlings. We did cover his film Harakiri in our World Tour episode, and I was very struck by that film and wanted to look into it, but never had an opportunity to dig into his work because it is massive, and we wanted to give it its due. So today we're doing it. We're talking about his big films, and also he's got some spooky films, so it will fit in with the season. But before we get into those films that we're talking about, let's talk about the guy that we're talking about. Who is Masaki Kobayashi?
Kobayashi was born in 1916 in Otaro, Hokkaido, Japan. And if you don't know Hokkaido, it is the northernmost island of Japan. Very, very snowy. And if you're ever interested in visiting Japan, it's actually the place where the cherry blossoms bloom the latest because it takes the longest to get warm there. So if you think you've missed the cherry blossoms, check Hokkaido. It's also where Sapporo beer comes from. He grew up as the cousin
sponsored by the
actress.
Hokkaido Travel Organization.
I'm actually really obsessed with Japanese tourism. I don't know if anyone knows that. I've never been to Japan, but I'm dying to go to Japan. So I've done just mountains of research about Japan and traveling in Japan, and I have not gone. One day, though, maybe one day when it's less difficult for pandemic reasons. Anyway, Kobayashi grew up as the cousin of actress and director Kinuyo Tanaka. And he studied Eastern art and philosophy at Waseda University in Tokyo. He started off as an apprentice at Sochiko Studios until he was drafted into the army during World War II, where he was sent to Manchuria. But he himself was a pacifist and a bit of a socialist and resisted the ideals of the war and the conquest of Manchuria and the subjugation of its people by refusing promotion above the rank of private. And that is a story that is going to sound just super familiar today. Anyway, after the war, he returned to Sochiku as an apprentice director and made mostly studio line pictures, very much kind of like that Studio Factory sense for a while, until Human Condition, which skyrocketed him to international acclaim, despite being fairly controversial within Japan for being critical of Japanese imperialism during the war. Eventually, during this kind of period of the late 50s through the 60s, he would make just superstar movies like Harakiri and Kwaidan, both of which won jury prizes at the Cannes Film Festival. And along with Kurosawa, Keisuke Kinoshite, who was his actual master director who he trained under, and Kon Ichikawa, he founded the Four Horsemen Directors Group, which was designed to make movies that appealed to a younger generation. I wasn't able to find too much more information about them, but they are curious. So if anyone knows any good resources about the Four Horsemen Directors, let me know. It sounds ominous. And
I think
it's
that they
fitting for a Halloween episode.
They made short videos that were 6 seconds long. They were the first TikTokers to appeal to the younger generation. Is that what that means?
That's actually a Vine. That's a Vine that you're talking about.
I don't know what the limit of TikTok is.
No, I'm poking fun at TikTok because TikTok is just Snapchat and Vine.
Yep.
But anyway, back to Kobayashi. He, like many other directors we've talked about, had a great unrealized project. Almost everyone has one. Orson Welles had 5, I feel like.
It was Superman with Nicolas Cage. Spoilers.
That was it, definitely. Anyway, this great unrealized project was Yasushi Inoue's novel about Buddhist China called Tan Huang. And I I don't know what that really entails. I didn't look up the book, but I'm sure from Kobayashi it would have been amazing. And he lived a very long, fruitful, productive life and passed away in 1986 at the age of 80. So yeah, that is the kind of bio summary of Masaki Kobayashi. And we are talking about 4 movies from him today, the total runtime of which is somewhere around 15, 14 hours.
Yeah, something like that. It's pretty long. So we're talking about 2 kind of distinct entities, though. So we have The Human Condition, which is 3 films, none of which are shorter than 3 hours, except one might be like 2:59 or something.
I think negligible. The second one is 2:59.
Yeah. So we have The Human Condition 1, No Greater Love from 1959. The Human Condition 2, Road to Eternity from 1959. And this is all, they were all kind of made at the same time and released over like a 4-year period, with the last one, The Human Condition 3, A Soldier's Prayer, coming out in 1961. But they would kind of all be playing at different festivals and stuff throughout those 4 years of release. Apparently, any film festival that or showing or overnight showing that they would do all 3 of them at, that Tatsuya Nakarai was at, would be always sold out. He is our main character, Kaji. He's been on the show before. I can't remember if he was in Harakiri, but he was also in Yojimbo. He was in 11 films with Kobayashi and 6 films with Kurosawa. So this guy, he like made the rounds.
He was the definition of Japanese superstar.
Yeah,
for a while there. He actually kind of filled the void after Toshiro Mifune kind of faded from Kurosawa's limelight.
Yeah.
In the late 60s, early 70s.
But he has a very, very different persona than Mifune. And Toshiro Mifune also did work with Kobayashi, which we'll kind of plug at the very end with Samurai Rebellion. And The Human Condition also starred Michio Aratama as Michiko. And
I love that Michio plays Michiko.
Yeah, I know. Anytime an actor plays a character that has their same name, I think it's hilarious.
It's I don't know why it's so funny, but it is.
Or plays against a character that has their same name is even better. But the Human Condition is based on a 6-volume semi-autobiographical novel of the same name, written by Junpei Gomikawa, and that those books apparently do not have an English translation, which is interesting. So this is probably the closest that we will get to knowing the full story without learning Japanese.
Those haven't been translated?
No, they haven't. According to Wikipedia, wild. Which knows everything. Yes. But as we'll get into, the films are apparently a very faithful adaptation, which of course explains the
very
runtime.
Direct.
So yeah, it's semi-autobiographical. So the author was a pacifist. Events from the film or from the story are taken from his experience during the war, and those experiences kind of overlapped with Kobayashi's, which is why he was drawn to tell the story in the film setting. Shot in Hokkaido, and since China-Japan relations weren't going on in '58, so there's also a lot of things like there are Chinese
mad at each other.
Yeah, there are Chinese characters in the film, but I don't think there are any Chinese actors in the film.
No, it's all Japanese, all Japanese actors, and all the Chinese in the films is pronounced phonetically. Which, if you know anything about how Mandarin works, is very
dangerous ground.
Is a dangerous ground to be playing on. And then there are very kind of stylized subtitles placed on the screen to translate into Japanese for Japanese audiences.
Yeah. And we'll get into all of that in a moment, but we'll be wrapping up the episode with Kwaidan from 1964, which was Kobayashi's first color film, and it is an anthology, also over 3 hours long, of 4 different ghost stories. One called The Black Hair, another The Woman of Snow, and then Hoichi the Earless, and finally In a Cup of Tea. And they're all based on a book of ghost stories called Kwaidan Stories and Studies of Strange Things, which alliterates great in English apparently, from 1904, which is kind of like Grimm's fairy tales type of collection of folk tales and stuff like that. Collected by a Greek-Irish guy who just was infatuated by Japan named Lafcadio Him.
He's an interesting dude. He actually published several volumes of these folk stories. He was a businessman who went to Japan on a job and fell in love with it and just kind of moved there, basically became Japanese, married into a Japanese family,
Greek-Irish.
took their name, had Japanese children, and just published a bunch of these stories. And well, actually, not all of the stories are from Kwaidan, but they're from Kwaidan adjacent books as well, all by Lafcadio. And we'll see some of the other titles later on when we get to that section. But he has a penchant for very nice book titles. They're all very entertaining and quite cheeky.
Yeah. And in that film, we also see Nakadai and Aratama.
Nakadai is he's the man in The Woman of Snow, and she is the first wife who gets left during the black hair story.
And that's all coming, but first, let's have Jason set up The Human Condition 1, No Greater Love for us from 1959.
The Human Condition, Part 1, No Greater Love from 1959. At the dawn of World War II in East Asia, Kaji marries his sweetheart Michiko, despite his dread of being drafted. To avoid service, he and his wife moved to Japanese-occupied Manchuria, where he works as a labor chief, a position that exempts him from the draft. But Kaji is a big-hearted pacifist and socialist, and his inability to stomach the treatment of the Chinese workers, or to save them in turn, jeopardizes the slim bit of safety he's earned for his wife and himself.
It's really nice that the breaks in The Human Condition are like pretty logical kind of story breaks. Like everyone picks up immediately where the last one left off, but there's also like, even looking back on it after watching these a few weeks ago, I could still tell in my head exactly where each of the films stop. It's not like they all just run together into one blur.
No, it's all very well constructed. I didn't go back and count the parts, but I feel like it's because it's a 6-part volume. It's a 6.
Oh, they do. They break book. Each film in half as well.
So each film is broken in half. So I feel like it follows the breaks in the books, if that makes sense. Which makes sense because this whole movie was actually meant to be very faithful adaptations.
Yeah.
Of the books, because Kobayashi was, I don't want to say obsessed with the books, but very, very much in love with them. And he actually carried a copy of the book on set with him as these movies were made. And he would try to squeeze in, like they went through the adaptation process, right, where they wrote the script and they made a logical script that would be, I guess, 9 hours long, and broke it up into 3 movies, I guess better than what they did with The Hobbit. But he would still try to squeeze in more scenes from the book when possible. Yeah. And they would still do that on set, kind of like on the fly or like the day beforehand. So they were really trying to just make essentially what we call like a very basic adaptation style thing. But Kobayashi himself is so good at like the fundamentals of cinema when it comes to composing a really good shot,
so good.
Or holding well, I would say composition, and then being able to hold the camera or place the camera in the right location and then hold it there long enough to get the emotion out of the actor.
Yeah.
Combine those, and that kind of explains why all these movies are so dang good, besides being based on a great work of fiction or semi-fiction, I should say. And also just having 2 phenomenal actors. Honestly, Nakadai blew me away in all three of these films. It was, and I've seen him before. I love him in Yojimbo, but he is incredible in this series.
Yeah. I mean, it's a rough journey too. So
it's hard to watch.
I know. I kind of want to talk about that, and we may need to kind of stack some of this conversation towards the third film so we can talk about the whole story overall. But here we're kind of like in the innocent phase. Like, as an audience, we don't know what we're getting into. The character doesn't really know what he's signing up for. He just knows he doesn't want to sign up for the war. But we're really establishing Kaji's character here. So this film is it is a massive growth and like solidification of Kaji's character, which will then subsequently be completely tested and broken down in the next two films. And it's like it starts off on ideological grounds at the very beginning in the first part, and then there's a point that we can talk about where it becomes practical. Like he has to draw a line in the sand and step over it at some point, and then that means that now he has his it's not even a full pacifism, but his ideals are firmly rooted in being, against the war and being against the mistreatment of all people in because he goes through many different circumstances where he is having to stand up for basic human rights and human ideals. And
yep.
This film is where he realizes that is not just a thing that is in his head, but he has to live that way. And like I said, then that will be tested in the next two films.
Yeah. He's a very good example of a character that you can build such a big movie or such a big story around, because the thing that makes him interesting on screen and generates a story around him is the fact that he refuses to fit with society, which is kind of a big deal. And I found multiple sources that talk about this in the Wikipedia articles and interviews surrounding this movie, where people talk about how Japanese culture tends to be very conformist. And at this point in time, especially during the war, it was very imperial and conquest oriented. And so the idea was that everyone needs to get in this boat with us and go along this way. And we need to conquer Manchuria, and it will be ours for the taking, and that will be good. But Kaji's the nonconformist, and that kind of creates both a dissonance within himself and like a dissonance within everyone else, where I don't even know if all the people around him are necessarily opposed at first to the ideals he's presenting, so much as the fact that he just refuses to go along with the program. And that creates a lot of tension and a lot of problems. And it continues to create tensions and problems wherever he goes, because he's a fundamental nonconformist. And so it doesn't matter what situation you put him in, there's going to be tension. And so, especially in a period of time, World War II, where everyone is being cruel, or cruelty is more on the forefront, whether justified or not in various circumstances. Some people might be able to debate, some people might not, but it definitely is so counter to Kaji's fundamental core being that he has to struggle basically anywhere he goes. So we can go on a tour of the full war, and we kind of do in a sense, at least this front of the war, over the course of these three films. And we always have something interesting going on with Kaji, because it's less about Kaji having to get over certain character flaws, except maybe that he's such a pacifist that he becomes passive at times. He has to learn to become active, but there's always going to be interest there. There's always going to be a story to tell and drama to take out of a situation, which for an experienced storyteller like Masaki Kobayashi is just, an amazing field in which to sew a movie. Like it's a fantastic setup, and he makes it work. It's almost like a perfect setup in a sense that, he just points the camera in the right direction and boom, you have a movie, which is a vast oversimplification, but it kind of almost feels like what happened. He's not doing a lot of stylized storytelling here. There's a little bit here and there, but most of it is very back to basics filmmaking.
Yeah.
Just on a grand scale with lots of wind.
Yeah.
Which I think just might be Japan, because we talked about Kurosawa's like wind fetish
with
during like the
Yojimbo
multiple Kurosawa episodes. But
Seven
like,
Samurai,
I think maybe Japan is just really windy. I think that's what we're getting at here.
Maybe that's
course,
why they like
winds,
Westerns so much.
Yeah, maybe winds of change. Maybe there's a metaphor in there, or maybe that kind of windy, desolate frontier feeling where it kind of feels, it's disconcerting. It doesn't feel pleasant. It doesn't feel placid. It feels like something's going to go wrong at any moment. That could be part of it.
Well, this one too, I think that you touched on desolation. I think that's important too, because there's a part of this film in that Kaji is removed from the war. He's trying to escape it. He's basically put himself as far away from the war as he can, so he thinks. And so there's like a removal. And once we get into the war, then we get into the literal jungles of Manchuria. So there's like a very stark environmental contrast between here, where we're not in the war, and the other two films when we are deep into the war.
Oh, for sure. For sure. There's also something to track over another thing to track over the course of the three films is kind of the sliding power dynamic. We actually see at the very start of The Human Condition 1 is when Kaji has the most power he's ever going to have in the series. And it just slowly vanishes over the course of the series through a series of events, which again makes for an interesting escalating story to tell and an interesting set of escalating circumstances to put your character through.
Yeah, I may push a little bit on that just because he does actually have men under him later. And here he's kind of representing the workers, but he's not really like, he doesn't really have any control over them.
Yeah, but he has the backing of like the company.
He has a
at
position.
The beginning.
Yeah, he has the best position here.
He has a position of authority, and even though there's a lot of fighting, and he maybe doesn't like he maybe is not part of the conversation. He definitely doesn't submit his situation very well at all. He starts off with a bunch of authority, and then just slowly kind of just pilfers it away over the course of the movie without accomplishing too much, which is kind of the horrible irony of it. He's spending all of his like credibility and spending all of the safety he's earned for himself and his wife trying to affect better circumstances for these Chinese laborers who are effectively prisoners.
Well, halfway through the film, they literally get prisoners, and he gets set over the POWs.
Yeah,
but before that, you're right. They're just like really poorly treated hired labor.
Yeah, they're basically a conquered people. Which is not a good thing, an enjoyable thing to be. Who he's put in charge of, but in order to try to get better circumstances for these people, he essentially spends all of his credibility, all of his authority, his safety, and all of it basically comes out to naught. Because at the end, everyone he's failed in providing safety. Everyone hates him now, besides his wife, and he's separated from his wife because he's sent off to the army.
Yeah, and I would say like I didn't see the outcomes of his efforts so much as a reflection of his character, as a reflection of his circumstances. Does that make sense? Like I feel like everything 100%. He does is principled. Like he is doing, what he sees as the best course of action in every situation. He like the contrast in basically every single thing that he gets put into from here until like maybe the very end of the third one is that he's unyielding. Like he has a principle and he's not going to let anyone kind of fudge it or whatever. Like that's why he comes in, like everyone is, basically doing their own thing, but they, they're like, oh, come on, just, take a bribe or just come on, just give here or there. And he won't give on anything. And he has an idea. He has basically all the right ideas of what needs to happen, but all of the everything he's up against is against him. Like literally, like all the structures are just like brick walls that he's basically banging his head against in a fight for the right cause.
Exactly. Because this whole thing is a giant piece of social commentary.
Which is interesting to see because we're looking at, and we've talked about World War II films before. We were talking on the Discord that like we've already done a whole like a huge array of different war films from different movies. From different angles of the war and stuff like that. But this film is interesting in that it's coming from really dark ones too. I know, but this film is coming from the losing side, but it's someone who's more aligned with the opposing side who ends up winning. And I would say that we were right in the fight that we took on in World War II, but someone who's coming from the other side who's more aligned with the winning side. And they're on the inside. Threat. They're surrounded by antagonism, and it's literally a losing battle from the beginning. And spoiler alert, that's where we end up.
I mean, that's a constant threat to Kaji, is that he's almost always, especially whenever he's causing a problem with his ideals, he's making it someone else's problem. Like he's standing by so staunchly that someone else is like, oh gosh, I have to deal with this now.
Yeah.
Then he's almost always accused of being a traitor or a Western sympathizer or a Soviet sympathizer. And that actually becomes really interesting in the third movie. But you are right. This is a giant piece of social commentary. And actually what's interesting with that, if you look at the tradition of Japanese cinema, is that most of the time these directors tend to fall on the more left-leaning side of things compared to society as a whole, especially in mid 20th century Japan, which was very traditional and conformist. And some would argue to this day, it even tends to be fairly traditional and conformist. Although I'm not qualified to comment on the state of such things, but they would pack most of their social commentary into period pieces. That was the common thing at the time with these Chanbara films, these period swordsman films. That's where they would put their social commentary. That's where you see something like Harakiri, which is all about social commentary.
Or even Samurai Rebellion.
Samurai Rebellion is a giant example of, in both cases, people who are fed up with the system, and it's so bad that they're forced to take dramatic action. Of course, in those movies, they take dramatic action that's violent, and Kaji is not that kind of guy. But one of the things that's interesting about this film in particular is the fact that Kobayashi was doing something that was kind of revolutionary. He was packing social commentary into a contemporary setting. Because even though the war was over, 1959, that's like it's living memory. Years.
Yeah.
I mean, like Kobayashi himself had served in the war. Most of the people who went to go see this movie had been alive and cognizant during the war. So it was scary, and it was controversial at the time. And in fact, the studio Shinjuku almost didn't let him make it. He threatened to walk essentially and go to another studio. And even though the run of movies he had made up to this point hadn't been, internationally acclaimed or anything, they had been successful, and they were scared of that. So he kind of almost like leveraged his way into getting to make this giant 9-hour social commentary piece by threatening to walk from the studio, which a 9-hour social commentary piece is not cheap and not a guaranteed moneymaker. So that's kind of wild that he had that much clout at the time. But that is impressive that he was able to do that. And it is kind of like an interesting sidestep in Japanese cinema and Japanese social commentary.
Yeah. And I will say, just to piggyback off your point about, this is not just a thing in Japan where you have to like cloak your social commentary because
that's exactly where I was going.
Okay. Because I mean, just as myself having to do this every time, this is where the Twilight Zone came from. Rod Serling took his war experience, and he couldn't make the kinds of films he wanted to explicitly, so he turned them into science fiction stories. So if you turn the enemy into aliens, it's a lot easier to make a story about how, you shouldn't mistreat POWs or just that kind of. And some of the Twilight Zone episodes are more explicit than that. There's an episode with oh gosh, I'm blanking on his name, but the guy who played Sulu in Star Trek, he finds a sword in his attic or something, and there's an American guy there, and the sword brings out their World War II enmity against each other. So there were some of those explicit examples, but for the most part...
I think they had that in the King Kong Skull Island movie.
Yeah, that's true. But I think that was in season 5. So at the beginning, Rod Serling was doing this purely through a heavy sci-fi cloak. So this is just to bring a more kind of more to home example of this is not just a Japanese thing of having to kind of hide what you're saying with a lot of theatrical garb.
Very common. To pull a very, very modern example, and one that'll be very popular come Halloween costume season, which is now, think about something like Squid Game. It is purposefully a hyped up, semi unreal social commentary that's kind of close to reality, but obviously super duper played up. But it's much more dramatic and affecting and easier to watch without having to think about it than it is to actually watch how people under a system that promotes heavy debt quietly and slowly suffer and wither away to nothing.
Yeah.
Squid Game is much more eye-catching and easier to tell that story. And you would be flabbergasted how many people I've talked to about Squid Game, and they tell me that, oh, I didn't like that. I was like, oh, what, you're not a fan of the social commentary or something? And they were like, what social commentary? I just didn't think it was gory enough. And I'm like, yeah, that's part of it. That's part of it. If you don't think it's gory enough, then you're the bad guy.
Yeah.
But it's a very common work of fiction, right? We tell stories through allegory to make it more approachable for us, or to explore more nuanced sides of things that are. It's kind of like a microscope, right? When it's in reality, it's too small to really think about. When it's blown up to the scale of a movie, it's easier to dive into and understand the itsy bitsy parts of it.
Yeah. All that to say,
or to be more impactful.
Yeah, all that to say, Kobayashi takes a big step here by just showing it how it is. No veil, no Hollywood makeup. It's just, this is what happened. This is not even some of it is fictionalized in the presentation, but it's not that far off from what was actually happening every day during the war.
Yeah, not very far off. And of course, I think they do a good job in this movie and I think this is because of the nature of the people who made it and the origin of it being a translated semi-memoir, of keeping it all very localized to one location, and then just kind of having the implication in the background, and even in the later ones kind of almost explicitly reminded that this is only one front of a mini front war.
Yeah.
There's all the European fronts. There's Africa. There's South Central Asia. There's all these other parts of the war that are flaring, and all these different atrocities are happening all over the place all at once. And it can be too much at times. And there's even parts of this movie where some of these movies, because I don't know about you, Jonathan, it feels like they're all blending together. I feel like that's just how we're discussing them.
Yeah.
But there's even parts of these movies that are almost too intense to really kind of wrap your head around it being real. But it is real.
And speaking of, I want to talk about the climax of this film, because the turning point of Kaji, who eventually has to literally put his life on the line for the ideals that he's been building up for the entire first part of the film. So this is a point where, and there's going to be, there's spoilers going to be mixed in here throughout until we get to the very end. There's one really big spoiler that we will put it out another one for, but this is the biggest part of this film, and then the second one has not anything that's too big. But in this film, there's a point where 6 of the workers or actually part of his POW camp that he has sworn to protect, but they don't trust him. They won't trust him no matter what. And his efforts keep getting sabotaged by various means. But at some point, 6 of them were about to be executed. And what they actually did at that point was not a capital offense. Like, they were not even, it's a legal technicality, but like they were not in a position to be executed. But basically, the people were demonstrating their authority, demonstrating their power, kind of like a hang the pirates as an example kind of thing.
Yeah. POWs are allowed by international bylaws, are allowed to escape and not be punished for trying to escape.
Yeah, but I mean, the point is that they weren't even out of the compound, so they hadn't even escaped or directly declared intent to escape. But at this point, the men are being executed, and the one who had been the most vocal about not trusting him, and he's finally, dying because Kaji, again, not necessarily through a direct fault of his own, was not able to keep them from the powers that be. And he actually lets that guy get beheaded, and then it snaps in him, and he steps up and he's like, no more. There will be no more executions. And this is 3 in. So this is 3 out of the 6. And then finally all the other workers come up and start chanting, very much like end of Bug's lifestyle. And so they get off with it.
Talk about packing social commentary into a palatable capsule there.
We already talked about Bug's Life as being an adaptation of Seven Samurai, so I'm not going to get too deep into that one. But
400 movies, guys.
Yeah, this is where we're at. But that's the point. There's a line where that Kaji says, "The only thing I regret is that I let you kill the first 3." But that was him solidifying his ideals to the point where he would suffer for them. Because after this, he does get tortured by the powers.
Oh, really tortured.
And then it ends with him getting sent to war. So that's the clear divide of this film. Now he was told that he would be exempt from the war, but now he's made them angry. So he's going to be basically ship him off and just let him die in the war. But that climax is so important. It's such an important turning point, especially to set up Kaji's character for the rest of the 2 remaining films. And there's also a really, really great shot where the one guy, again, the main guy who's been kind of egging him on, like he's been trying to earn this guy's trust, this prisoner's trust. Mm-hmm. And all the 2 other men who's gone before have wailed. They've been, terrified, pleaded for their life. And this guy comes up and he's like, I will walk myself over there. And he looks Kaji in the eyes like, this is your fault. And the camera does this thing where it starts on a Dutch angle. It might even start completely horizontal. There are a couple times when that happens. I think that might be later in the 3rd movie though. And the camera rotates until it's completely even right when the guy gets to the sword. And it's just that determination of purpose is basically contagious, and it's what infects Kaji, and that purpose follows him through, most of the rest of the 2 films. The testing of the purpose is the point of the next 2 films.
Oh, for sure. And tested it is.
Yep.
100%. We're sort of sliding into the second movie now.
Yeah, we should do that. Let's talk.
You want to pause for Jason to explain what that one's about?
Yeah, Jason, give us the next chunk of the puzzle.
The Human Condition, Part 2, Road to Eternity, from 1959. Kaji is a soldier now. The training is hard and military life is cruel. Kaji still tries to protect people from the system, but he's about to be as unsuccessful as before. He's placed in charge of new recruits, all middle-aged due to the attrition of the war. Soon they'll have to go to the front, and Kaji will have to face being powerless to protect in the chaos of war.
I will say, I feel like the subtitles for the 2nd and 3rd films should be switched. I'm not exactly sure where these subtitles are coming from.
I don't necessarily get Road to Eternity. A Soldier's Prayer kind of makes a lot of sense to me where it is.
I think so. I feel like because the end of Human Condition 3, like it's very much a journey back. It's his attempt to get to a journey back. So Road to Eternity would make sense. And then this one is all about his time as a soldier. And so it would make sense.
I could see that too.
So I don't know.
No Greater Love makes a lot of sense to me because it's about dueling romances. If that makes sense, because there's
I actually meant to bring that up because
him and his wife, and then there's a parallel romance that's also separated by the war, but Kaji can do nothing to affect between the prostitute and the POW.
Right. And even more than that, the phrase "no greater love" is part of the phrase from the Gospels. No greater love has any man than this, than he would lay down his life for his friend. And that is
there you go.
That is the point that I was just talking about that Kaji has to come to, where he has to put his life on the line for the prisoners that he has sworn to protect.
Yeah.
So yeah, but when we get to Road to Eternity, this is his time in the war where he is oh gosh, I'm not actually completely clear on some of the hierarchies in the war at this point, but he like goes from his time as a recruit through being over recruits, but still like low man on the totem pole with the other.
He was refusing. So one of the storylines in here is that he does start off training, and the training is brutal, so brutal that one of his friends in training essentially gets bullied into suicide.
Which is super important.
Which is super dark. Oh my gosh. And also not necessarily. It was another guy in his training group that was essentially just really ill fit for war, right? Like just he should not have been here in a million days, but there he was, and he just got thrown into like this toxic, cruel environment that just tore him to shreds. But one of the things that's I think really neat about Kaji here is that we actually find out that he is an amazing soldier. He is.
That's really interesting.
He's obedient. He is a fantastic shot, and there are lots of people over the course of this movie that want to promote him, and he's just like, no, I don't want to be, because I don't want to be a part of this nonsense.
Although I will say part of the motivation for promoting him was to keep him quiet. Like there's a really interesting line where one of the guys is like
trying to pay him off.
The more like privilege and power we give him, the less inclined he'll be to rock the status quo, which is also a really important aspect of the social commentary and the anti-war or anti-military commentary that's coming through these. Yeah, exactly. And that's one of those things that parallels the author's life and the director's life. Yeah, right.
Which makes it really interesting. And it also, I think that's important because it makes all of Kaji's actions more noble in a sense, because he's always opting to be there. He's always choosing to be in the situation he's in, that out of the options that the system's allowed him, he's chosen basically like the worst one where he thinks he can affect the most good.
Yeah.
Even when the higher up offers to put him in charge of the recruits and he refuses, the person who puts him in charge is like, well, I thought you could spare them a lot of trouble. You could just see in Kaji's eyes like, oh, well, you said the words. I guess I got to do it.
Yeah. But it's still rough because and again, I don't understand fully the hierarchy, but his recruits are still bullied by the other trainers. And he, like I said, he seems like
a lot of it's by years.
Yeah, I guess that's true, because the other communist sympathizer is like, you've been here 3 years, but you're only a private, so that he kind of had like a mentor in that respect.
So this is one of the things I do know about Japanese culture that's really big. How old you are or how long you've been in a certain position versus someone else who's in a similar position matters a lot. And actually, one of the first things that you do when you meet a new group of people is tell them your age and get their ages, so you know who is kind of socially above you and who's socially below you. In a sense, it's not super strict, but in a very rigid environment like the military, especially the Kwaidan during World War II, yes, that matters a lot. And there's a lot of language that you see in this movie about Kaji only being a 2-year man and some of these men having been in the army since like the early days of Korean and Manchurian conquests, or before then even, and how that experience gives them privileges over a man like Kaji, and how dare he think he can be above them, even though he's clearly not trying to be.
Yeah.
But it's clear that these men are fearful of their own position, and then if someone else comes along and rocks the boat, then their position is threatened. So everywhere Kaji goes is a disruptor, just trying to make things better. But by making things better, he's disrupting the system that gives people certain privileges. And so that's a threat to those people, and they will do everything they can to stop him.
Yeah.
Including beating the crap out of him, which happens quite a lot.
There's so much slapping in these movies.
Well, and here's the thing. A lot of that was real.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily know why it was real. Maybe it was because it was such long takes and there wasn't a lot of cutting. So there wasn't, which is an interesting point here. There's not a lot of cutting in these movies. There's typically fairly long takes with a lot of actors in them. So it's very well coordinated and directed. But essentially, they just didn't do any cutting on slaps, nothing like that. He just gets hit in widescreen repeatedly. And apparently, Nakadai's face was repeatedly swollen throughout the production.
It's the OG method acting, man.
Like Nick Cage pulling out his own teeth.
Or Leonardo DiCaprio eating an elk spleen or whatever.
Elk spleen. Hey, sometimes you gotta eat the elk spleen to get the Oscar.
To get that Oscar, yeah. Yeah, and I will say that, like, kind of on a thematic level, this film, if the first film is him solidifying his purpose, this film is him kind of wrestling with the existing implementations of what his ideals are. So he knows what his ideals are, but he's trying to figure out if there's any system that fits. So he wrestles with communism and socialism throughout these films, but he doesn't necessarily come to the point that that's the best system, because he realizes that there's a lot of hypocrisy in those systems as well. And democracy is brought up in there as well, but it's not like one of the main forces that's tugging on his attention. But it is it's heavily like imperialism and totalitarianism versus socialism and communism, which the latter seem on paper to be the more desirable, which they always do. But there's also like finer points of implementation that he realizes also have their drawbacks.
He's realizing that a system might not be enough to overcome the human condition. Title drop.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, yep. All right, Jonathan, we've already talked a lot about like the kind of the broad strokes of these movies. Do you want to move on to the third one, A Soldier's Prayer?
Okay. Yeah, I think kind of plot wise, the main thing to bring up in the human condition too, because there's actually a lot to hit in the third one, but in the second one we get him going through the war into culminating with an actual battle, and that's where we end on the third one, or on the second one. And then after the third one, it's kind of like after the war. It's not really after the war, but he has distanced himself from it. But the main point that to bring up on the second film, I think that will be important for the main discussion of the three films together, is the scene with his wife, because this is the last time we see his wife. And he
last time he sees his wife.
There's a scene where his wife comes because she is missing him so much, and he's given privileges to have a night with her. So they have this night, and all of his co-soldiers are like giving him crap for it and stuff like that. But it's interesting because I almost had this thought, and I haven't fully fleshed it out, but I'd be interested if you kind of think that there might be something there, that if we kind of think of this in more metaphorical terms or something, it almost seems like if we're thinking of Kaji as the Japanese people and the way that they are moving collectively away from imperialism after the war. So when these films are being made, but also if we kind of think of his wife as like this idealistic picture of Japan and this kind of like national identity that came with somewhat with their imperialism. And then we get this moment where Kaji wants to see his wife like bare, like in like all of herself, just her. And he wants to just have this image in his mind, which is the last thing that he sees of her. I mean, he says goodbye to her, but this is like the last thing he's left with. And then he never sees her again. And so it to me kind of felt like there's this ideal of this perfect, beautiful Japan. But after it is stripped away and laid bare, there's also this point of moving away from it. And then there's a striving to get back to this Japan that doesn't or may not ever exist again, that is this striving to get back to it that is kind of his undoing towards the end. Or there's something in himself that he may have marred that makes that return impossible. I just was thinking of it in kind of these novelistic, grandiose terms, and I thought that was an interesting thing that I may not be qualified to make the grand social connections there, but it was intriguing to me.
I'm not sure. That one's very hard to say. It's definitely a good interpretation of the presentation. I didn't catch that as I watched it, but that also doesn't mean it's not true. I also don't know whether or not that's the artist's or the writer's intention.
Right.
But that also doesn't qualify it as being a valid interpretation or not. So I think that's a good way to look at it, especially considering how torn Kaji is with like the idea of the idea of the situation of his people. It kind of makes sense along those lines where he's trying to improve the situation of everyone around him and the people he can help and maybe improve society in the process. I don't know. One's hard.
There's
hard
also
to say.
Another element to it that comes from the first film where Michiko is like really jealous for him. So she wants to serve him. I think she gets advice to like just serve him, do whatever he wants. So it's kind of like this almost serve the people kind of a thing. But she also is like tugging him. She kind of pulls him away from his ideals sometimes, or she is a force that pulls him away from what he knows he should be doing. Not that she's ever antagonistic, like, in the literal terms, she's kind of an ideal wife. But again, that's kind of part of a veneer of nationalism that can go with that too.
Yeah, for sure.
So that's the main point that I wanted to bring up with the second one, because we're not going to see her again, but she is still like a very heavy driving force through the third film. But let's get into the third film because there's a lot of meat in the third movie.
There is.
Or not a lot of meat at the very beginning. Jason,
very true.
Jason set it up for us.
The Human Condition, Part 3, A Soldier's Prayer from 1961. The Japanese forces have been shattered. Manchuria is lost, and the Soviet army is in full advance. Kaji and what remains of his unit are desperately trying to survive. They find a collection of Japanese civilians and decide to flee the war zone. They wind up struggling and dying through a dense forest, only to be met by more horrors on the other side. Eventually, Kaji winds up a prisoner in a war camp where the fellow Japanese are crueler to him than the Soviet guards. Pushed further and further away from his humanity, Kaji clings desperately to the prayer of seeing his beloved Michiko again.
All right, so this one is maybe one of the hardest to watch. It's very much
rough. The first
like
20 minutes of this movie are rough.
Yeah. There's a lot of death. There's a lot of brutal death. There's some Apocalypse Now vibes in parts of it. It very much mirrors the attrition of the final days of World War II on many fronts of the war. And in this one, it very much shows that the slow, grating death, this longing hope, that even as our hero Kaji tries to get back to his beloved Michiko, as he goes, he's trying to get back to her, but it always feels like he's moving farther away. And the situation's getting darker and darker and more desperate.
Yeah, and that is an explicit purpose at the beginning of this film. He starts with the two other soldiers from the battle that survived with him, and he lays it out in like the very beginning of the film. He's like, I am done with the war. I am going home. You can come with me or you can't. You can't pull rank. I am out of the war. It doesn't matter to me anymore. And so as he does that, again, that singular purpose for him of getting back home is what drives him through really dark situations, and also what attracts people to him to some extent. So, in the very beginning, we get this point where they're just completely lost in the jungle. And they have other refugees from the war, and they're coming with them, and they start to, this is actually, oh gosh, we could spend an hour on this whole jungle scene, because this is really where his
they spend close to an hour on the whole jungle scene.
Yeah, the jungle scene is a microcosm of communism, because he has a certain amount of resources and he has people that he cannot serve with that amount of resources, and he wants to do it all very evenly, and he wants to save it for the survivors, but he has to watch people die because of this way that he has structured the way that he wants to deal with his resources, which not saying in this instance if that is the right or wrong way to do it, because there's no win situation when they're doing this, but he has to literally sit there and watch people's babies die, and then them desperate and eating poisonous mushrooms or literally just hanging themselves. Like he's watching the repercussions of this kind of like scarcity resource management that he is now in charge of. And and then we get into,
which was also like a terrible situation set up by a war that basically stripped the land of everything. It goes layers and layers deep. And again, it's an example of how ideals maybe aren't the best way to confront the human nature. I
don't know that I would say that, but it does beg for more nuance, I think. Like situational nuance.
Like you can't expect the human condition or the human nature in general doesn't react in an ideal way to any set of circumstances. And specifically, I don't think you can put that into a box contained by an ideal, regardless of what that ideal is.
Right.
But you are right that he is put into a no-win situation. He tries to apply his ideals, but it really didn't matter what he did. Someone was going to die, and a lot of people end up dying.
Yeah. So then they go through. This one is very much almost an odyssey. Like there are very specific, as he's going through this journey, he comes upon situation after situation that are almost their own like isolated episodes. So there's an instance. There's the one scene with the village of women, which I almost see as like a Island of the Lotus Eaters kind of a thing, where they come to this town that's almost entirely populated by women who are just routinely taken advantage of by both the Russian and the Japanese soldiers. And the main one is talking about how the Russians are nicer to them than the Japanese are, and so he's confronting the way that his own army is maltreating the survivors and the inhabitants of Manchuria. But then he also has to stand up for himself and not partake of the women, for lack of a better way to say it, because he still has his loyalty to Michiko, which, again, is being tested throughout the entire film. There's a lot of that kind of sexual depravity that goes through this film with the soldiers who rape the one girl when they send her home. Again, we have like some minor spoilers here, but these films are an experience.
He calls them out. He kills one of them.
Well, yeah. So this incident starts off as a minor thing and becomes the climactic moment, because basically right after the quote unquote Island of Lotus Eaters incident, they are captured by Russians because he does not want to start a battle and endanger the lives of the civilians there. And so they're captured by Russians. And now it's so interesting. The end of the film where he is a POW in a labor camp, complete 180 from the first film. And he is experiencing the worst conditions. And all the things that
he's also plagued by just a terrible, terrible translator.
Oh my gosh. That was fascinating too.
That might have been the hardest part for me to watch during the whole movie, was watch that translator just purposely sabotage him.
I think that the most frustrating part of that scene is that it is even more than the horrible violence and the institutions, but that language barrier presents such a feeling of powerlessness. Like
helplessness, yeah.
He is explaining himself as eloquently as he can, and the other guy's like, I think he said that your commands are stupid. And you're like, well, that's not basically what he said.
Yeah. It's also one of the best pieces of like subtitle work I've ever seen. It's just the fact that there are subtitles that creates like the exact definition of dramatic irony, because Kaji and the Soviet commander have no idea that they're being mistranslated at first, and only Kaji eventually picks up on it.
And then he has a mental breakdown, and he's like, all the explanation of the translator is blurred out, and we don't hear anything that he's saying, or we don't get subtitles for it. And Kaji's just like, he literally has an internal dialogue. There's actually a lot of internal dialogue in the third film, and he's like, he's not going to understand anything that I'm saying. He will never know what I need. And then the one comrade or whatever comes up, and he's like, so you need better working conditions, right? What else do you need? Medicine? And then he gets medicine, but then he also gets shipped off to Siberia or whatever for a week or something.
Forever, kind of.
Well, kind of, because he comes back, and then we have like the real climax of the third film.
Once you go to Siberia, you never really come back, Jonathan.
Right. This was okay. I do want to say that the three films here basically encapsulate every war film we've ever seen in these three movies. Like, I feel like everything from The Great Escape to like Dr. Zhivago to Bridge Over the River Kwai, like everything has a parallel within these movies. It is all here.
With how specific these movies are too, it's very surprising that they managed to capture so much of humanity in them, and it's quite impressive. And it's one of the reasons why I don't think we've mentioned this yet, but The Human Condition, the trilogy, is one of the best rated movies ever. It's consistently like in the top 5. All three are in like the top 5 or 10 on Letterboxd. And that's the only reason they're not slightly higher is because there's one movie that's constantly in the top on Letterboxd as a joke. And also, I think we mentioned this, but the way it affected Masaki Kobayashi's career is just, you can't understate it. It basically gave him carte blanche to do whatever he wanted, wherever he wanted. And actually pretty soon after The Human Condition, he left for Shinjuku for Toho, which gave him like a 6-film contract, carte blanche nearly. And the last of that 6-film contract is Kwaidan, which we will talk about very shortly.
But before we leave The Human Condition, let's put down our blanket like spoiler warning. Like, if you want to experience this film, go do that. Skip the last part of this discussion, because I do want to talk about the very end. Because this is very different than other types of movies. So I was even thinking during our discussion of the recent film A Hidden Life, which is about an Austrian.
That came up in my while I was watching too.
Okay, yeah,
very similar.
So it's an Austrian, basically pacifist who would not join the Nazis, and ended up being executed for it. But the whole point is that he would not back down. He would not say,
wouldn't give an inch.
He would not give anything.
People were trying to give him like outs to be like,
protect your family, or like just do this, or just whatever. But he was like, I will not serve in any capacity under the Nazis, and he was executed for it. This was also based on a true story. The interesting thing about The Human Condition is that it's not a Kaji dies in his ideals. He actually breaks.
He definitely breaks.
And I think that's so interesting because we set up his ideals. We spent so much time setting up his solidifying them, like we talked about in the first film, and kind of refining them and looking through the different ideals in the second film. And the third film, it's just like continued beating down to the point where the soldier who raped a girl that he had entrusted to send her back home, and then he gets put over him in the friggin' labor camp, and he tries to entrust his other sick friend to him while he's off in Siberia for a week, and he comes back and realizes that not only did he not help him get better from being sick, but he literally made him carry the crap from the latrine back and forth until he fell down and died. And Kaji loses it. And he decides he's going to escape. So he, again, becomes the POW from the first film that tried to escape 3 or 4 times under his watch. But this time he decides to wake up the other guy.
He goes hard.
Yeah, he wakes up the other guy in the middle of the night, beats him to death with a chain, and drowns him in the latrine. So takes that a step further, and then escapes. And then he tries to get back home, but is ridiculed by the Manchurian citizens, and eventually just collapses in the snow with the name of Michiko on his lips, and he's like playing scenes of their reunion together in his head. But again, at this point, she's just a memory. She is just an ideal, and he continues striving and walking towards her until he just completely collapses of exhaustion and dies.
They literally did that whole shot is they just made Nakadai lay there until he was covered in snow.
It's ridiculous.
Which is crazy. It's a fantastic shot. But yeah, they did do that whole thing.
Yeah, I was thinking The Revenant when he's just like slogging through the snow, literally only covered in like a potato sack or a gunny sack or whatever it was. And yeah, it's the third film is brutal because it's like you've built this whole thing up, and then you realize, like, I mean, when we're talking about the situation though, his fight is a losing one. I mean, the thing that literally took it literally took the atomic bombs in order to change all the things that Kaji is fighting for in this film. And that's not something that he can implement on his own, obviously. So it's like this structural thing, but as a single person, it was a losing battle. And that is...
He was not able to fight a system.
Yeah, that is the tragedy of The Human Condition.
There you go. Yeah. It's a really good movie. I love how different tonally each of the 3 movies are. Like, they cover the same theme, so they're thematically connected, but tonally they're different. And this one very much feels kind of like post-apocalyptic in a lot of senses.
Yeah.
It kind of feels like a
like
group
The
of
Road.
Like survivors in a zombie movie, or The Road, where you're just kind of wandering through from like this episodic dangerous adventure to episodic dangerous adventure. And slow attrition as cast members are lost.
Yeah.
Kind of peeled off almost in a horror movie style, but the horror is war and what humans decide to do to each other because of it, or feel compelled to do. It's dark. It's
which
nasty,
brings us
heavy.
to Heart
It'll
of
sit
Darkness.
with you for a while.
Let's just throw everything that has parallels to The Human Condition in here.
Yeah, well, I think what we're finding, Jonathan, is that any other major piece of media that has a significant commentary on the human condition or human nature is connected to this.
Yeah.
Because it's so, well, one, this one's just good and robust and layered and deep and wide, and you could watch this movie multiple times and come away with a different, extract even more meaning each time just because it's so deep.
Oh, yeah. I imagine the second watch of this will be completely different knowing where it's going.
Yes. Oh, yeah. All right, Jonathan, anything else to say about The Human Condition Part 3?
So much more, but not in the scope of this podcast. Like, each of these films could be its own, like, well-developed podcast. But I think that about covers it for the overall of those films. So, yeah, let's move on to our spooky Halloween movie, Kwaidan from 1964.
Kwaidan.
Jason, tell us what all the little pieces of this movie are about.
Kwaidan from 1965. The Black Hair. A poor swordsman leaves his beloved weaver wife to marry the daughter of a rich family. He soon regrets this, and his new wife, furious that her husband doesn't really love her, just her money, sends him packing back to his ex-wife. Except what he finds at his former home is more beautiful and more terrifying than anything he could imagine. Part 2. The Woman of Snow. Two woodcutters travel through a deep snowstorm. They take refuge in an abandoned shelter for the night, but the cold takes one of their lives. It appears in the form of a yuki-onna, a snow spirit taking the form of a beautiful woman. She spares the second woodcutter for his handsome face and youth, but warns him never to tell of their encounter. And so the woodcutter keeps the secret to himself. He meets a young woman, falls in love, and has children. Life is wonderful until one night when he decides to tell his wife the tale of the snowstorm and the spirit in the cold. Part 3. Hoichi the Earless. Many years ago, a great sea battle was fought to determine the ruler of Japan. The Minamoto clan defeated the Taira clan, sending their child emperor and his retinue to the bottom of the sea. The graveyard of this battle is now watched over by a temple of monks, among them a blind biwa player named Hoichi. Hoichi specializes in telling the story of that very battle, and one night is approached by a stranger who wishes him to come tell that tale for his lord, and so he does. The story is a lengthy one and takes many nights to tell, so he goes again and again. One night his friends follow him to his performance and pull him away, informing him that he's been playing to the ghosts of the Taira army this whole time, and if he continues to play for them, they will tear him apart. To save him, the priests of the temple write out the entirety of the Heart Sutra across his body, making him invisible to ghosts. They've only forgotten to mark his ears. Part 4. In a Cup of Tea. A retainer resting at a tea house sees a strange visage in a cup of tea. The face there is not his own, but a stranger's. Despite the oddity, he drinks the tea. The man in the cup of tea appears at the retainer's lord's house later while the retainer is on guard duty. He sounds the alarm, but no one believes the intruder is real. Later, the tea man's 3 retainers appear and challenge the guard to a fight he almost loses. But this is where the tale ends. Seeking the resolution, the publisher or the author of this story arrives at the author's home, only to find something truly horrifying.
All right, Jonathan, before we talk about some of the meat of this movie, I want to talk about some production details. We did mention that a lot of the stories in this movie come from Kwaidan. Specifically, the full title is Kwaidan, Stories and Studies of Strange Things from 1904, written by that Greek-Irish dude who fell in love with Japan. But there are a couple stories. Black Hair is actually pulled from a book called The Shadowlings from 1900, which I thought was appropriate considering the name of our podcast. And then In a Cup of Tea, the final shortest of the...
but the one that really frames the rest of the film, I feel like.
It does. It's a perfect one because it's meta.
Yeah.
It's a good capper. It's from a collection called Being Japanese Curious with Sundry Cobwebs from 1902, which is just an incredible.
Sounds like a angsty Tumblr account.
It really does. It sounds like all of his titles sound like something you would find on the internet, and I just really appreciate that because he's a man ahead of his time. He was obsessed with Japan and named things after Tumblr posts. Maybe he's a time traveler from now that just went back in the past and fell in love with Japan. Maybe that's the secret. But anyway, a couple other production things real quick just to put a backdrop here. One, this movie is anthological. Most of the stories run at about 45 minutes. The third one, Hoichi the Earless, runs at closer to an hour.
That one's intense.
And the last one, That one's deep. And then the last one, In a Cup of Tea, runs about 20 to 30 minutes. This is also the first color movie that our boy Masaki Kobayashi did, and he had fun with it. Jonathan, This whole thing feels very theatrical, feels very kabuki-esque.
It's all set. It's not location. Yeah.
It's all very clearly on a set, too. There is no hiding the theatricality here.
Right.
They're not trying to hide the seams. They're not trying to hide the fact that everyone's wearing over-exaggerated makeup.
And it's great because it's not like anyone is saying, "Oh, Kobayashi couldn't afford to go shoot on location somewhere."
No,
because he made the freaking human condition.
Yeah. He spent like 3 years shooting in Hokkaido. He's good. The style here is one of stylization, and specifically a theatrical kind of like Japanese kabuki theater-esque style, which is perfect because these are all traditional Japanese tales, and that's a traditional Japanese art, so it makes sense. It tracks, and it just it's fun. It's fun with the setting, with the big over-exaggerated eyebrows and armor and hair and the
black teeth.
The black teeth. Which is theatrical. Also, if you're curious, the black teeth at a certain point in time, I can't tell you the exact era, was considered like a mark of beauty. In noble ladies.
Yeah, the way that I heard it described is I think this was from a Shakespeare biography, so I think it was Elizabethan if we're talking Western timeframes. But that was a sign of royalty or wealth because only the wealthy could afford sweets, and they would eat sweets and rot their teeth out because they didn't have dental care. So it was considered very, very rich to have rotten teeth. So you would color your teeth if you still had them and make it look like you didn't have your teeth.
Interesting. Much like how that same time period in Europe, it was considered attractive for a man to have a large gut, as that was a sign that you were wealthy enough to eat, or how it was considered attractive to be ghostly pale. And women would paint themselves with white lead paint to try to look like the Queen Elizabeth and give themselves lead poisoning. All right, Jonathan. So what did you think of the first of our stories, the black hair?
I'm still trying to kind of wrap my head around the overall presentation, because the stories are not like we would normally think of, but this one definitely has that kind of a twist, but there's also this blurred line of like where this psychosis comes into play.
I think this one's mostly I think a lot of these are kind of meant to just give spooky vibes.
Yeah, that's kind of what I felt.
Like they're not hard stories. It's more of like a tall tale that you kind of hear of. Like, did you hear the legend of this?
Good. Yeah, good way to put it.
It's very the whole thing has, kind of the Grimm's fairy tale Aesop's fable thing going on, but without clear resolutions.
Which is actually pretty appropriate for Grimm's fairy tales, because some of those are just like, okay, so what just happened?
Yeah, no, exactly that. And I think a lot of that is maybe because of how these stories tend to work, because they tend to be fairly organic and told by individuals over
probably
wide areas,
evolving
and
from
so,
oral traditions.
Yeah, exactly. It's so, to go to Grimm's, because I'm a little more familiar with those areas. Your grandpa up in the Black Forest probably tells the story a little differently than your cousin down in Bavaria. So the story probably shifts a bunch, and I'm willing to bet that a version that ends up in Grimm's fairy tales or Aesop's or Shadowlings or Kwaidan tends to be kind of like the average.
Well, I will say that there's a difference between
like the detail.
I will say there's a difference with Aesop's, because Aesop's mostly have like a point to them. Like, this is why you should
parable.
Make friends. Yeah, these are less parable and more like Grimm's. It'll just be something really weird happens, and then there's like, that's just it, and you're like, okay, so like some of them some of the Grimms have a little bit more of a story basis to them, like the ones that we're really familiar with, along the lines of Rapunzel, etc. But a lot of them, when you read through them that you've never heard of them because they don't really make a lot of sense. Like they don't really have a
they don't
beginning,
really
middle,
land.
end. Yeah.
I mean, they're spooky, but they don't really land.
Yeah. But I think that vibe, it's more of like an aesthetic experience than like we're trying to figure out why we should not like war.
Yeah, and I feel like a lot of it, like especially the first one, is like it's kind of like you shouldn't leave your wife.
Oh yeah, that does translate to that.
Don't chase riches. Chasing riches will get you dead, I guess.
Although I think the other part about the first one that was kind of confusing is I was trying to, which is probably just my own fault, but I was trying to get ahead of it, and I wasn't sure where it was going because it was making a parallel between the first wife's hair and the second wife's hair, and then he comes back, but it's also so stylistic that there's nothing to hang your hat on. Like when he comes back home and it looks exactly like he did when he left, so you're like, okay, something's up. But also at the very beginning of the film, it's so vague and like there's only him and his wife there. There's no sense of their life because they're just symbols of this that exist for the story. So it was
on stage.
It's hard to tell where the weirdness is supposed to start because the whole thing is kind of set in this amorphous wasteland, story wasteland.
Yeah, it's set. It's all set on a stage, right? Like it's very much bare bones storytelling, and I don't think Kobayashi definitely doesn't do much, if anything, to kind of give names where there aren't already names or give context where there isn't already context. We're kind of seeing more of like his direct adaptational style here in a sense, right?
Yeah.
Like he's just directly adapting these and matching the vibes of the story, kind of bringing out the theatricality, which makes Kwaidan a lot of fun. Maybe harder for a 3-hour sitting. Of course, the cut on Criterion is much longer than anything that was previously released. Right. Sort of like a director's cut of sorts.
But I could totally see this being, Netflix miniseries material. I could. Someone just puts out, 4 kind of spooky things. Nowadays it would probably be like, we got 4 different directors to put out an episode of this thing, and it just like kind of holds together, and it's 4 episodes right before Halloween comes up, and then that's just it, and you like watch it, and that's cool.
Yeah, exactly. What did you think of the second one? Our one that has Nakadai back in it.
Yeah.
Where we have the Snow Woman. I feel like it has a good loop to it. I feel like it has a tragic ending, but I feel like it lands a little soft.
Yeah. Because I think that one suffers a little bit from kind of really loose rules around the supernatural elements.
100%.
The first one doesn't need it, but this one, like, you kind of have to explain why she spares him because she falls in love with him at first sight. Fine, that's like a very Greek mythology kind of thing. But then he tells her, he like breaks his promise by mentioning her, which he doesn't even remember the part where he said he would never tell anybody. But then she spares him again, but she leaves, so it kind of like ruins his life. But she doesn't kill him like she promised.
She leaves. Yeah. It's a nice twist, but it's very confusing as to why she doesn't, or why she has to leave the second time. I think like it might invalidate her power in some kind of way, but
along those lines, my question is, are their kids demigods? Like, who is she that she can bear children?
I'm not entirely sure. So she is, so Yuki Una are like mythological creatures in like a sort of way. They're just these snow women. I think like a dryad of sorts, or like a siren of sorts, but snow.
Okay.
And yeah, they can kill people. I'm not super familiar with the rules of them, which is weird to say because they're like folktale creatures / cryptids. Like they're not
This may be a thing where we may have gotten more out of it had we had a little bit more Japanese
I think this is a cultural
literacy.
Context thing. Yeah. I think if we had taken those Japanese folklore classes in college, we would have been able to enjoy this a little more. It did have me Googling a little bit about them, but I don't think I got too deep on the subject because I was trying to tackle a lot.
Yeah.
But yeah. Now the next story, the third one, is something that I know a little more about.
It's the meatiest
one. Just because I know about the Genji War, just because I played the campaign in Age of Empires.
Did you sing the campaign
as a kid? I did not sing the campaign, but Hoichi does. And this is the story where we have the signature Kwaidan image of Hoichi covered in the Heart Sutra.
Mm-hmm.
It's been written all over him to protect him, but in a very
this one does have rules.
Way,
I think this one
get to cover his ears.
Yeah, this one makes the most sense because it does have rules. And
I think that's why this one gets the most time.
They have consequences. Yeah.
Yeah. No, this one's good. I quite like this one. Was this one clear? Was this one easy enough for you to understand, Jonathan?
Yeah, definitely. I think the main thing that was weird in the presentation is that it spends so much time doing the song and reenactment at the beginning, which you kind of need it as backdrop, but then we also we pick it up throughout the story. So it felt like a long time of going through their little skirmish reenactment. And then also I wasn't sure about the master of the temple. He seemed like he kind of believed some stuff, but he didn't believe other stuff. He was like, you were just singing to the gravestones. But he also believed that there was a ghost coming, but he didn't believe that he was going to their temple or something like that.
Oh, I have no idea, man. It was... Yeah. Again,
little
it suffers
things,
from having one or two actually developed characters,
right?
And then everyone else is just the priest,
right? This one had comic relief though. It had some
it did.
little
this
bumbling
one was the most
monks.
Built up. It was very clear that this one was the one that Kobayashi liked the best,
right? Yeah,
and so that's dope. And then of course we have the final one. In a Cup of Tea, which is a meta one about a contemporary story writer writing a story. Then we see that story, but the story is uncompleted, and so
but then it is completed.
That
one was actually
see what happens.
Very Twilight Zone.
It was very Twilight Zone-y.
So yeah,
especially the ending was incredibly Twilight Zone-y.
Which it's coming, but you gotta do it for the satisfaction.
Yeah, I like that one. That one was the most... I mean, they all have ghostly elements, but that one was maybe the most horror-esque.
Yeah.
Specifically.
And the funny thing is, that one, the main story at the beginning is completely unfinished, and it leaves you... But it acknowledges the open-endedness of it, and I think it also acknowledges the kind of, open-ended, unsatisfactory nature of some of the first couple of stories.
It kind of makes the whole thing work.
Yeah, and so, but then
it's a very well picked selection.
And then it leaves the question at the end, and it's so how would a story of a man drinking another man's soul end? And it's that's kind of the point, right? It's you get pieces that build to a question, and they, what does it mean if you leave your wife for to increase your rank and get a rich wife who doesn't care about you? Have you killed your wife by leaving her? Is she going to haunt you? With the, what happens if you're spared and someone else isn't? Does that change your life? What happens? So it's kind of amorphous, but it does give something there is an audience participation element to each of the stories that the last one kind of presents.
Mm-hmm. And I'm going to make a point now that's going to, as it always does, kind of slide us into overall notes before we actually slide into overall notes.
All right.
But one of the best things about this movie that makes it work, and it's something you kind of just talked about with the meta nature of it in A Cup of Tea, is the fact that Kobayashi is just really has good taste. He's developed that taste. He's exposed himself to a lot of culture clearly. And he knows how to pick good stuff. I mean, look at his body of work. Most of it is adaptation, is him picking stuff and then making it into a medium that he's experienced with. And to really strip down what it takes to be a good artist or a good storyteller or a good filmmaker, when you need the skills, obviously, and that comes with time and learning and being open to change. But that's something that anything comes with. That's something that's part of getting good at cooking. That's something that's part of getting good at driving a car, is repeated exposure and willingness to respond to constructive criticism, to develop those techniques and skills. But the other thing, the thing that makes you a good artist or a good storyteller or a good filmmaker, is good taste, because that influences what you make.
Yeah.
It's much like the souls you drink in your cups of tea. You got to pick good ones in order to get good out of it. And clearly Kobayashi has good taste, and he knows what he's doing. He knows when a story, he's a good curator in a lot of senses. If you look at Kwaidan, he picked out stories that work well together. He put them in a good order, and he even tempered each one to last the right amount of time and come at the right point in the story. Look at The Human Condition. He approached that, and he made a very informed, honestly, good taste artist decision to be like, I'm just going to present this. I don't need to change a lot of this. We're just going to make this. So, and that's what he did. And look at what he made. It's brilliant. So, I can't state that enough. Go watch a lot of movies if you want to do this. Go read a lot of books. Go expose yourself to a lot of culture, because this is where it gets you to having good taste. If you limit your intake, you're not going to grow or something. Essentially, I'm telling you to drink more souls. Drink more souls, people. Look how many souls Kobayashi drank.
I think that reminds me of a quote that I think I brought up on the podcast before, but from one of the AFI conversations. I can't remember who said it. It honestly might have been Weiler or Wilder, but someone asked them, "Do you have to be a good writer in order to be a good director?" And they said, "No, you don't have to be able to write, but you have to be able to read." And I think that's really important, because it's looking at literature and books and stuff and knowing not just what it is, but what it's about, like what's underneath it. And I think Kobayashi does a great job of pulling out those things, like where you can make really specific, like human to human connections, but also like societal implications to his work. Like he knows what's going on underneath the surface of the stories that he's presenting. And of course, Human Condition, he has a very direct connection to, because a lot of those situations mirrored his own experience within the war. But even when we're talking, we have these as honorable mentions if you want to watch more Kobayashi stuff, which you should. But even in Harakiri or Samurai Rebellion, like these are stories that have things going on underneath the surface. Also, it's just great to watch Toshiro Mifune go rampage for the sake of true love in Samurai Rebellion. But I just love that part where he's like, "Your love is so beautiful and so pure. I've never had this, and I must fight for it." And you're just like, "All right, go for it, Toshiro." Yeah.
If you think anime is where Japanese culture started getting extra, you are wrong. you are wrong. It's been there the whole time, and I love it. I'm here for every second of it. Masaki Kobayashi, one of the best things about him is the fact that he does this social commentary, and you see it through basically all of his work, and his boldness in doing it in a contemporary setting. In The Human Condition was risky, but man, did it pay off. And it made it his stuff. It basically gave his stuff kind of this timeless quality where you can go back. There'll always be, I hate to say it, I think there will always be some kind of abuse of power. There will always be someone trying to abuse power somewhere in the world. And as long as that exists, there will be a need for social commentary. So it kind of gives a lot of this timeless quality. And speaking of social commentary, we need to talk about who we are going to be talking about next time on the podcast, Jonathan. And Jonathan, is that William Wyler?
It is not William Wyler. It's Billy Wilder. And we are not immune to the mix-up, so we're actually going to...
It's such a joke.
We're going to try to amend that here towards the end of this year, but we're going to start off with Billy Wilder, and we're going to talk about some of his films. Both of these directors are amazing. They both made some of the greatest films from the golden age of Hollywood. And so we've gotten a smattering of Billy Wilder films. We actually took some time to try and get like a range because he made a lot of different kinds of films. And
almost all of his movies are like fantastic.
Yeah.
Like
so
classics.
He made a lot of films that fall in various categories. So we've picked a little bit of each. So we have a noir in Sunset Boulevard from 1950, which is also going to be his movie, which we like to talk about directors as movies. And then we're going to talk about his war film Stalag 17 from 1953 and his romance Sabrina from 1954. And finally, his social commentary, comedy, drama, romance, The Apartment from 1960.
I am definitely looking forward to watching a lot of these for the second time. Actually, yeah, all of them for the second time because I've seen each of them at least once, if not multiple times. So I'm very excited for that. I'm excited for you guys to get a chance to watch these or have a reason to watch these for the first time if you haven't seen them, because it is just really, really, really good stuff that needs to be watched again.
Yeah.
Oh, good social commentary, still prescient to this day, excellent stylization. The list goes on, and we'll talk about it in depth next time on the podcast.
But if you would like to support us in the meantime, you can head over to Patreon. We have a Patreon account where you can support us, join our digital community, and listen to our recordings live, like today, where we realized we weren't recording until half an hour into the podcast. So you can hear all those mess ups live, and you can also find our bonus podcast. Where the last thing that we covered was a short film by Spike Jonze to go along with our Spike Jonze episode from last time called I'm Here, which is a robot film starring Andrew Garfield. So if you want more content from us, check out the bonus podcast and the Patreon.
Well, that's about all the time we have for this episode.
To find links to things that we talked about today, as well as a complete list of past episodes and all 399 films we've covered so far, visit thefilmlings.com.
You can also join us for ongoing film discussions on our Discord server.
And to stay posted about upcoming episodes, follow us on Twitter at The Filmlings.
Summaries for each of the films in this episode were recorded by me, Jason Harden. Find me online everywhere at The Blue Jay 1994.
If you like the show, let us know. Leave us a review on iTunes so other people know what we're all about.
We definitely appreciate it.
Talk to you next time.
All right, see ya.
Did we ever start recording?
Oh, shoot. I did.
We never did a clap or anything. Oh, crap.
I'm sorry. No, we didn't do a clap.
Oh, my God. Oh, no.
So, options.
Do you do a backup recording of stuff?
I have your cell phone recording.
Okay. It's not great, but I don't really want to re-record the stuff. Okay.
Yeah. I think we had a good run. That's fine. I may or may not put a little disclaimer at the beginning, but yeah, that's just fine. Start rolling now.
Yeah, that's fine. Oh my God. I can't believe we totally spaced on the clap. That's wild.
We've only done this 130 times.
We've only done like 400 movies, guys. Whew. Boy.
Oh man.
Okay. Ready for clap, I guess.
We're supposed to be pros.